I'm Dr. Helen Spurling and I'm an ancient historian in the history department at Southampton, and I'm particularly interested in the relations between those in power in the ancient world and minority groups. So the sort of contact and conflict that you can see between them. And I'm going to share a particular aspect of my work with you today by looking at resistance to empire in the ancient world, Romans, Jews, and apocalyptic thinking. So how will I look at this theme of resistance to empire? Well, I'm going to present a particular argument to you today in this lecture using the Roman world as a case study. And I think that when you look at the sort of famous Roman historians, you can see how they're frequently emphasizing the supremacy of Rome and the honour and morality of its civilization. And this is often in contrast to other peoples that, according to them, don't quite meet Rome's standards. But I would argue that what we need to do is look beyond the traditional narratives given to us by Roman authors to try and capture minority voices. And in order to do this, I'm going to focus on Jews living under Roman rule in the very first century of empire. And I'm going to introduce you to a range of different sources, but one of the examples will move beyond the sort of traditional histories to include apocalyptic primary sources that are a really important means of giving us a different perspective on life under Roman rule, and in fact are just a really good way of highlighting resistance to empire. So what is apocalyptic? What are apocalyptic writings? Well, you might immediately think that they are sources describing the end of the world, and you would be right, they do. They describe the end of the sort of current age and the start of a new world order, but they're much more historical than you might think. So apocalyptic writings use sort of coded and symbolic language to comment on the historical circumstances of the author that has written the text. So what I often do is describe this sort of source as a form of political commentary. So coded language is used to critique those in power and the sorts of policies and actions that they undertake. So in this way, apocalyptic writings are a form of sort of literary resistance against the dominant ruling power. This means that apocalyptic sources are a real marker of historical change. It's a reflection of sort of social or political crisis when people write these types of texts. They highlight the fears that historical change might bring. And really importantly, they tell us a lot about attitudes to historical events at really crucial periods of world history. So you can see that apocalyptic primary sources can just be hugely valuable in giving us a different perspective on a historical period. So as I say, the case study that I'm going to share with you today is relations between Romans and Jews in the 1st century CE. So just to give you a little bit of context here. So Pompey, the general, conquered the Eastern Mediterranean and the Jewish homeland centred on Jerusalem in 63 BCE. And you can see that region marked out on the map on the slide there. Jewish kings did continue to rule as what we would call client kings until 6 CE, but from 6 CE, Roman governors take over rule of this particular region of the Eastern Mediterranean. So this means that from the 1st century onwards, Jews were a minority group living under Roman rule. And this was difficult for Jews in some ways because they had really lost independent rule. But also because they were monotheists. They only worshipped one god in a Roman world where taking part in the Roman cult and the sort of worshipping all of the different gods was sort of an expected part of life. You do find that Roman attitudes towards Jews varied, and actually the fact that Jews had ancient customs was really respected by the Romans, but they still found aspects of Jewish culture quite strange. And you can see on the right of the screen a quotation from the Roman historian Tacitus, who describes the Jewish religion and culture at length. And what he says, so again, he's talking about Jewish religion here. Quite different is their faith about things divine. The Jews have purely mental conceptions of deity as one in essence. So that's that sort of monotheism idea. They call those profane who make representations of God in human shape out of perishable materials. They believe that being to be supreme and eternal, neither capable of representation nor of decay. They therefore do not allow any images to stand in their cities. So you can see that what Tacitus is describing here, he sort of struggles with the monotheism of Jews, that the fact that they just worship this one single deity, but also that they don't allow any worship of idols, which was a really important part of Roman religious practice. So I think it's important to talk a bit more about Jewish monotheism and the temple that they use. And Jewish monotheism is really underscored by the fact that Jews conducted a number of their religious rites at the single temple that they had in Jerusalem. But what you need to understand is that this temple, the Jewish temple, it represented a statement on a huge scale. So first of all, the temple was the house of God, and so it represented for Jewish people the presence of God on earth. And was as such a sort of a tangible sign of their relationship. It's also very much a monotheistic statement for Jewish people living in a polytheistic world. There's only one God, so he only needs one house in one land. So just the fact that there's this single temple in itself is quite a big statement. And as a result, because there's only one God and one house, it was only in this temple that the requirements of the sort of covenant, the relationship between God and the Jews, could be fulfilled. And this covenant actually demanded sacrifices. And it was only at the temple in Jerusalem that these sacrifices could actually be offered. So there are all these really important sort of religious reasons why this temple was so significant, and it really made a statement about Jewish life. But it's actually also just really important for all aspects of the Jewish world. It's a centre of sort of social life, it's a centre of economic life. So this is just a hugely important institution, and Jews really expected this temple to last forever. And you can see that point's highlighted in the quotation from 1 Kings on the slide there, where King Solomon of the Israelites is saying, "I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." So this was meant to be around for all time. But what you find is that in the 1st century, there is a real decline in the relationships between Jews and Romans that leads to a really big disaster for the temple that I've just been talking about. So the Jewish war against Rome began in 66 CE while Nero was emperor, and it's one of the longest rebellions that the Roman Empire ever had to face. And so there are really big questions around the sort of causes of this revolt. How did things get to a point where the Jews are sort of openly rebelling against Rome? And there are scholars who really focus on the sort of ideological nature of the clash between Judaism and Roman religion and culture. So Jews really expected to have an independent monarchy centred in Jerusalem. But of course, at the time of the 1st century CE, they're living in a province ruled by Roman governors. So promises of a sort of everlasting Jewish monarchy that were enshrined in sort of Jewish sacred text in the Bible means that inevitably there are hopes for independence from Roman rule. They sort of think, why are we being governed by these people? And then it's compounded, this sort of potential ideological clash is compounded by the fact that Jews followed monotheism in a world of Roman polytheism and the pantheons of gods that they worship. So some scholars ask, was this sort of an inevitable clash of cultures between Jews and Romans that led to this war that began in 66? But I think it's important to say, as is often the case, there are a number of other historical factors at play here. So it's important to note that the Jews at this point were really embroiled in a quite serious civil war. So there was a lot of internal fighting between different Jewish factions. And of course, the Romans cannot tolerate any instability within their empire. So this would be something that perhaps would lead the Romans to come and besiege Jerusalem. And I think another important point is that this civil war actually is not sort of isolated from Roman behaviour, because it had partly been sparked by the incompetence of Roman governors in the region, who basically didn't take account of Jewish customs properly. So you've got all of these sort of internal factors going on. But then during the course of the revolt, Rome started experiencing its own political difficulties. And on the death of Nero, the emperor, there was this huge succession crisis, leading to 4 different emperors within 1 year. And the last of these 4 emperors, somebody called Vespasian, he comes out on top, but he needed to consolidate his rule. Which scholars have again argued is a major reason for the harsh suppression of this Jewish rebellion. And so what was the outcome of all of this? Well, the Jewish war led to the capture of Jerusalem by the Romans, and most significantly, the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. Now, I cannot emphasize enough just how absolutely devastating this would have been for the Jewish population. They've lost the centre of sort of political, social, religious life. The fact that this temple is destroyed raises questions about the power of their God, their relationship with their God. Had they been abandoned by their deity? So some really big questions raised by this sort of destruction of the temple. And Jews really hope that it will be rebuilt because it's such an important symbol to them. But actually it's never rebuilt. And the wall in Jerusalem today, where religious Jews still go to pray, is actually the remains of the temple destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. So you can see a sort of direct connection there with what you can see in Jerusalem today. So given all of these events, as historians, how are we to understand these sort of different situations and responses to them? And I would argue that if you just look at the Roman perspective on this, then you will definitely get quite a skewed impression of what happened and how the population felt about it. You'll basically get only the Roman perspective on all of this. But fortunately, we also have historical evidence of Jewish responses, including through the apocalyptic writings that I mentioned, which can really tell us the other side of the story. And I think what we need to do is sort of bring this sort of range of different perspectives together to try and understand the Jewish war against Rome. So let's first of all look at some different sources, and we'll start with the Roman perspective, because that can give you a sense of a sort of traditional Roman narrative. And Tacitus, I think, is an excellent source here. So who was Tacitus? Well, he was a very important senator who lived from around 55 to 110 CE, so during the events of the Jewish war. He's not just a historian, he's a very important politician. He's close to the imperial court throughout the late 1st and early 2nd century CE. So I think perhaps the first thing to point out is that he represents really an elite Roman perspective on all of these events. And Tacitus wrote a major history of the Flavian dynasty, so that's Vespasian, Titus and Domitian. So the emperors who are in charge over the period of the Jewish war and its aftermath. And he's very keen to present these emperors well, which is reflected in how he writes about the Jewish war. Not so much Domitian, I should say. He's not too keen on Domitian, but certainly Vespasian and Titus, he wants to portray them very, very, very well. And I think his work is interesting because it does sort of mix together different genres of writing. So you'll find elements of sort of biographies of emperors in there. You'll find sort of ethnography in there where he writes about different peoples. And because he does that, it's how we know a lot about his perspective on the Jewish population. So key to his whole argument in this is that he presents Titus, so the son of Vespasian and the Roman general who suppressed the Jewish war and then went on to be emperor himself. He basically presents Titus as this sort of great soldier, and the Jews he depicts as seditious. And you can see these emphases in the quotation on the slide. So it says, early in this year, Titus Caesar, who had been selected by his father, that's Vespasian, to complete the subjugation of Judea, and who had gained distinction as a soldier, began to rise in power and reputation. So you can immediately see sort of how he's playing up the sort of greatness of Titus here. He's a good soldier, he's getting a good reputation for himself, and so on. And then it talks a bit about Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the capital, and there stood a temple of immense wealth. So there's some sort of recognition of the importance of the temple to the Jewish population there. And it goes on to say about the Jewish people, their numbers were increased by a vast rabble collected from the overthrow of the other cities. All the most obstinate rebels had escaped into the place, and perpetual seditions were the consequence. So what you can see here, this sort of very sort of negative depiction of the Jewish population as sort of seditious, obstinate, rebels and so on. And that really, for Tacitus, contrasts with the sort of greatness of Titus and the sort of reputation that he holds. But of course, this is very much the Roman perspective on all of this. So let's have a look at another type of source. And our next source is by somebody called Josephus. And I've picked him to talk about because I think he's a really interesting figure, because he is Jewish. So he definitely has a Jewish perspective on this. He was born in Jerusalem in 37 CE. And actually, not only was he sort of present in Jerusalem during this war, he was actually a general in the war. But what we find, he gets captured during the course of the rebellion, and he decides, after he's been captured, to become an advocate for the Romans. So he becomes a major sort of spokesperson for the Romans, trying to convince the Jews who are still fighting to sort of step down. So what you find about Josephus, he is Jewish, but he's equally and also completely a Roman and a Roman citizen. And he writes histories of the Jews that will appeal especially to a Roman audience. So he's a really interesting source because of this sort of dual identity. And he wrote a book called Jewish War. It's several volumes. To explain the destruction of the temple, which is something, of course, that his Jewish community was dealing with. And he suggests that it was fate that this happened, that it was always part of God's plan. And he also goes, quite interestingly, to a lot of trouble to try and absolve the Romans, and especially Titus, of blame for the destruction of the temple. So this is very important to him. He wants to sort of try and play down that this was the fault of the Romans. And he also, in the course of writing, wants to try and present the Jewish population as positively as possible to the Romans. He wants to say, yes, the Jewish people they're not troublemakers, that we've had this rebellion, but actually it was really only a sort of section of society that was doing this. And what he's trying to do there is he's trying to sort of counter anti-Jewish feeling that the Romans were expressing after this revolt. And you can see Josephus's perspective in the quotation on the slide, which says, so I'll read out, so I will prosecute the actions of both parties with accuracy. Yet shall I suit my language to the passions I am under as to the affairs I describe, and must be allowed to indulge some lamentations upon the miseries undergone by my own country. So he starts off by saying, I'm going to try and present everybody involved in this fairly, but you'll have to allow me to be a bit upset, because basically this is, you know, the temple has been destroyed. He has to be allowed to have some lamentations about this. But then he goes on to say, for that it was a seditious temper of our own that destroyed it, and that they were the tyrants among the Jews who brought the Roman power upon us, who unwillingly attacked us and occasioned the burning of our holy temple. So you can see very clearly here, he's saying that actually it was a specific section of Jewish society, tyrants amongst the Jews, who had a sort of seditious temper, that are to blame for the destruction of the temple. It was they that brought Roman power down on the region, and basically the Romans unwillingly attacked the temple and destroyed it. So you can see he's really trying to sort of say this wasn't the Romans' fault really, which is a very interesting perspective given his dual identity as both Jew and Roman. You can see how he's trying to speak to quite different audiences, I think. Okay, and our third source and final source is a text called For Ezra, and this is our apocalyptic source. So it was also written by a Jew in the late 90s CE, so quite close to the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple, and it offers a very different response to that of Josephus. So first of all, it's a direct response to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by Rome. And again, as I was saying about apocalyptic works, it uses very symbolic language to depict events. And it talks about a vision of an eagle and a lion. So this eagle is all sort of terrible, and there's a lion that intervenes in the eagle's actions. And what you can see, it's a sort of allegory in a way. That the eagle is a symbol for Rome. This is not particularly subtle, as the Roman standard carried the image of an eagle, so it was quite obvious that this was a way of sort of talking about Rome. And the lion figure represents the Jewish leader who will stop the eagle in its tracks. And what the text does, it predicts the end of the eagle, which will face judgment for its actions. And the Jewish people will then see the restoration of their temple as part of the end times, basically. So I think what's amazing about this source is you can just get this really incredible sense of the critique levelled at Rome. And this is critique that you would never see in the traditional narratives. And it really describes Roman rule in these very sort of horrific terms. And again, there's a quotation on the slide, so you can get a sense of this. So it's talking about this eagle, but it's really addressing Rome here. And it says, you have held sway over the world with much terror, and over all the earth with grievous oppression. Therefore you will surely disappear, you eagle, and your terrifying wings, and your most evil little wings, and your malicious heads, and your most evil talons, and your whole worthless body. And the whole body of the eagle was burned. So you could just see in the sorts of language that's coming through here, the way Rome is being described and its fate. It's an enormous level of protest and resistance to Roman rule that's offered by this particular text. So let's bring this together. And I think just to sort of reiterate, we really frequently have the Roman perspective on their civilization. So they sort of present it as supreme. And if you just read the traditional Roman histories, you get the impression that their civilization is better than any other in the world at that point. But when we look at sort of minority perspectives, as we've just been doing, you can actually see there are very different and diverse views amongst minority groups. So minority perspectives are not uniform. And you can actually see in the case of the Jewish perspective here that there are some who welcome Roman rule, such as Josephus. He wants to accommodate them. He wants to sort of work with the Romans. But there are others there who deeply, deeply resent Roman rule, such as in 4 Ezra. And so I think what 4 Ezra and apocalyptic texts like it do is offer us this really valuable sort of evidence of protest and resistance against empire, which can really provide a counter view to that sort of traditional depiction of the Roman world. And so what I would say is that as historians, we need to examine a variety of sources to understand the Roman world. So not only from the Roman perspective, but also the perspective of those that they conquered and ruled. And bringing together diverse evidence in this way can give us a much richer picture of history. So thank you very much for listening.